Okay, so welcome to all of you to the today's meeting as part of our seminar on Muslim Prophetology. My name is, for those of you who sign in for the first time, my name is Besnik Sinani. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at the Center for Muslim Theology at the University of Tübingen here in Germany. We have reached almost the end of this very exciting series of seminars on Muslim prophetology that has covered aspects of theology, aspects of, we've had historians who have contributed to this conversation, people who have looked into the Sufi tradition, different denominations within Islam, and so on and so forth. And so it's been a very exciting and rich conversation, and we're very grateful to the people who have participated and who have contributed to this. So it is an absolute pleasure to have today Sherali and Tareen, who's joining us from Franklin Marshall College in the United States, where I believe he's been teaching since 2012. He is known to many of you who work on Islamic studies as the author of Defending Muhammad in Modernity. And it shows his interest on intellectual history, particularly in the early modern period in the Southeast Asia. But as I believe it will come up in today's conversation, the questions the questions at the center of this prophetic politics, they are relevant to a lot of different kind of context in the Muslim world today, and they are connected with debates that are happening in among very different Muslim communities around the world. Sherali, we are absolutely thrilled and very, very grateful that you joined us here today. I'm pretty sure this is going to be an absolute treat. So I should stop talking here at this point and ask you to kind of present your work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Besnik, for that really kind and generous introduction and for your time in organizing the series. And I'm really honored to be part of a roster of scholars who are so formidable that it's really an honor and pleasure to be here. And I really want to thank everyone joining here for the gift of your time, and anyone who will click on this link later for your time as well. So I thought what I would do today is, because in the prompt, in the invitation, Besnik had asked me to talk about different notions of prophetic authority and prophecy among South Asian Muslim scholars, with also a view to discussions on the finality of the prophet. So that prompt basically is what I will try to answer here. And I will try to do that by focusing on some aspects of my first book, Defending Muhammad in Modernity, and I will try to talk about things that I have not previously talked about in other lectures or book talks that I've done on this. So I'll do something that has not been done before, drawing on that first book. And if there was time, I will also talk a bit about my second book, which is on intra-Muslim debates on Hindu-Muslim friendship. But again, the Prophet's role is quite interesting and quite central in that project as well. So in a nutshell, the question that I've been interested in some ways in both of these projects, although both of them are quite different in terms of their particular focus, thematic, and in terms of the actors whom they cover. But one of my main interests has been to explore the question of when a Muslim community loses its political sovereignty, how does that generate and animate debates on the relationship between divine sovereignty, Prophet Muhammad's authority and charisma, and the everyday ritual life of the community, this relationship between divine sovereignty, prophetic authority, and the ritual life of the community. So in some ways, we can think about this as theology, law, and everyday practice. And when I was researching for my first book, which explores an intra-Muslim debate among perhaps the most formidable and most influential and most prolific of South Asian Muslim scholars of the 19th century, who belong to these two normative orientations and reform movements that came about in the late 19th century once South Asia was colonized, called the Deobandis and Barelvis, which refer to two towns in northern India. And these two scholars who were Hanafi legal scholars and also major Sufi masters. They had a very acerbic but also very productive and dense and philosophically engaging debate. And my first book was on that particular debate and its predecessors in the early 19th century, when these debates had not taken on a group-centered orientation yet. So it was basically a 19th and late 18th century story of intra-Muslim debates on the relationship between divine sovereignty, prophetic authority, and the practice of everyday life. So when I was researching that book, I noticed that most of the questions that occupied the intellectual energies of these scholars had in some way or the other to do with the status of Prophet Muhammad in conditions of modernity. So, for example, questions like prophetic intercession was very avidly and heatedly debated, which occupies part one of my book. The question of the Prophet's knowledge of the unknown, ilmul ghaib, was a very important debate. In fact, that was, theologically speaking, the most consequential debate, as a result of which some of these scholars had charged their opponents as even unbelievers, and that is what made this debate so controversial. The question of heretical innovation to the Prophet's normative model, or bid'ah, is a very important subject that they debated. The question of, does God possess the capacity to produce another Muhammad, which in the South Asian context came to be known as Imkan-i-Nadir, or Imkan al-Nadir. That is actually something I will focus on today in my talk today. So the question that emerged for me as a researcher is, why are all these questions and these points of debate so centered on the figure of the Prophet? And how does one explore this? How does one analyze this phenomenon? And why is this really happening? I mean, these debates are all, of course, have a much longer history in Muslim intellectual thought in South Asia and elsewhere. But the degree of competition and the intensified nature of these debates really belongs to the late 18th and really to the 19th century, early 19th and late 19th century. The degree to which these questions were debated and the degree to which everyday practices and rituals came under the ambit of these debates, what is heretical innovation, bid'ah or not, and this concentration of competing notions of reform and competing notions of a moral Muslim public being invested in the figure and the body of the Prophet, there was something thoroughly new about that. There was something thoroughly modern about that. And to me, then, the question was, what kind of an analytical frame can one employ to explore this question, to analyze this question? So the analytical frame that I then settled on had to do with exploring this intra-Muslim debate as a reflection of what I call in my book as competing political theologies. Basically, by that I meant competing conceptions of what I've been describing here, the relationship between divine sovereignty, Prophet Muhammad's authority, and the practice of everyday ritual life. Now, this category, political theology, as it has been employed in Western academy, especially in the last 3 decades, in much of the scholarship inspired by the German lawyer and scholar Carl Schmitt, of course, dealt with the question of how is the modern state or modern forms of politics indebted to earlier theological notions of sovereignty, right? That was the underlying question and answer space, or the underlying problem space animating this discussion of political theology, whereby the main argument was that as much as the modern state pretends to be or calls itself as having completely eclipsed earlier theological orders and forms of politics, in fact, the modern state really is a new manifestation and new apparition of earlier notions of divine sovereignty, whereby the divine could enact the exception by announcing the miracle, and the modern state announces the exception by announcing the emergency or an exception to the constitution or the norm of the time. So as much as this scholarship was productive, what I did in my book was to inverse the problem space and to ask the question not so much of how modern politics and the modern nation state is indebted to earlier theological notions of sovereignty, but to in fact ask the flip question, which is that when we are investigating theological debates on things like prophetic intercession, on things like bid'ah, etc., theological and legal debates, how are these debates reflective of competing political imaginaries, competing ways of imagining the relationship between the human and God? How is that connected to new notions of politics that emerged by the late 18th and the 19th century? And in some ways, what I was trying to do in that book was to really expand and rethink the very category of the political, whereby the political is not only invested in discussions on the state and ideal forms of Muslim, statehood, and statecraft, but in fact, politics has a lot to do with how a community fashions its moral life in the everyday. That really, this question of the relationship between divine sovereignty, prophetic authority, and the practice of everyday life is deeply political. What could be more political than the question of how do we fashion a moral Muslim community? So I was really trying to expand and rethink the very category of the political beyond just the juggernaut of the modern state. So having said all that as a preliminary to my comments here, basically what I argued in that book was and that's why I called it Defending Muhammad in Modernity, that at stake in this debate, at stake in this intra-Muslim debate, which has some interesting parallels with other contexts like Saudi Arabia, etc., as well, the debates in the Hijaz as well, prior to the 20th century, um, that at stake in this debate were competing notions of the Prophet, which then mapped onto competing notions of an ideal Muslim public, whereby, to put it very, very simply and put it very, very succinctly, according to one group of scholars, and that would be the scholars of Deoband, and before that, their predecessors, and I'll talk about one of those predecessors today in a moment. For them, the perfection of the Prophet's prophethood really depended on the perfection of his humanity. And they also had a notion of prophetic love, but loving the Prophet meant celebrating his humanity, first and foremost. And for example, one of the most prolific scholars associated with the Deoband school, who's very well known, Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanvi, died in 1944. He had this really iconic statement where he was once critiquing his opponents from the Barelvi school, and he said that they turned the Prophet into a god, but a defective one. And we consider him a human, but a perfect one. So we are the ones who elevate and venerate him, and they're the ones who denigrate him. So completely flipping this charge, which was oftentimes levied against the Deoband school, that they cheapen the Prophet's authority, etc. And they said, no, in fact, we are the perfect lovers of the Prophet. And with this emphasis on the humanity of the Prophet, they really wanted to re-emphasize and re-energize divine sovereignty, which they saw being lost, which they saw having been dampened in conditions of modernity, which led to all these new ritual practices and habits and customs in everyday life, which they considered to be heretical innovations. I won't get into the details of what those rituals were. Chief among them was the ritual of celebrating the Prophet's birthday, which was very heavily contested, and I have multiple chapters in the book dealing with that particular ritual. But this basically was their cosmology, that emphasizing and re-energizing divine sovereignty meant celebrating and re-emphasizing the Prophet's humanity, which led to a public sphere in which people were constantly aware of and cognizant of not transgressing the limits of divine sovereignty by glorifying the Prophet to the extent that it compromises divine sovereignty. So that for me was one kind of political theology that is trying to re-energize divine sovereignty by emphasizing the humanity of the Prophet, and then also ordering the ritual life of the community in a way that honors and that abides by this relationship between divine sovereignty and prophetic authority. Now, for the other school, the founders of the Barelvi school, chief among them, the main founder of the Barelvi school, a scholar called Ahmad Raza Khan, a really important polymath of the tradition who died in 1920, his main argument was that you cannot consider divine sovereignty and prophetic authority or prophetic charisma to be mutually separable. They, in fact, are mutually constitutive. That you cannot think about divine sovereignty and its primacy without thinking about the Prophet's role and his position as the most esteemed and as the most beloved of God's creation. So according to him, the underlying flaw in the hermeneutic and the theology of the Deoband scholars and their predecessors was that they considered divine sovereignty and prophetic authority as two separate and mutually exclusive entities. And there was no way to abide by and to honor divine sovereignty without honoring the status of the Prophet at the apogee of the spiritual hierarchy. So for them, this kind of a relationship between divine sovereignty and prophetic authority then also generated a conception of the public sphere and ritual life of the community that actively tried to venerate the Prophet as the most beloved of God's creation through rituals like the celebration of the Prophet's birthday and others, etc. So two closing points I want to make in terms of the preliminary, and then I'll go to a case study to make it more specific. Two points to really close this things off. One is that I really try to argue throughout the book that the commonplace or the most popular stereotype about this intra-Muslim polemic, like many such intra-Muslim polemics, was that this is some kind of a debate between scholars of law and scholars of Sufism. The banner bearers of Islamic law and the Sharia and Puritan scholars like the Deobandis and their predecessors. And then on the other hand, you have the soft Sufis, the Barelvis, who allow rituals like celebrating the Prophet's birthday, so on and so forth. So throughout the book, what I tried to do was give ample evidence in the course of 12 chapters to really, and there were other scholars who've done that as well, but maybe they had not gone into the textual kind of nitty-gritty of their thought, of these scholars' thought, to really make the argument that this was not a debate, or this was not a contestation between law and Sufism, but rather this was a manifestation of competing political theologies, competing notions of the relationship between divine sovereignty, prophetic authority, and the practice of everyday life, in which at stake was, how do you imagine the prophet in modernity? Uh, and that imagination of the prophet mapped onto the imagination of what a moral Muslim public must look like in conditions of modernity. So this was a much more sophisticated and a much more complicated debate than one between legal scholars and Sufi scholars. So that was point number one. And point number two was that this is not a debate between reformers and non-reformers. So Ahmad Raza Khan, the Barelvi scholar whom I just cited, he also was deeply suspicious of the conduct of the masses. He also deeply critiqued them, even when it comes to rituals like celebrating the Prophet's birthday. He had a number of problems he had with the conduct of the masses. So it's not like he did not have a conception of reform, especially when it came to Muslim women. It was a very gendered kind of reformist discourse. So he had a notion of reform. But his main argument was that rather than completely banning these practices by calling them bid'ah or heretical innovations, you should just cleanse the impurities or the problems or the uh, um, the the moral defects that the masses have introduced into these rituals. So you purify it rather than ban it. Whereas for the Deoband scholars, the conditions had reached a point where it was an emergency situation. So they use this principle in Islamic law, saddu daraya, that you block the means to any harm. So for them, divine sovereignty had been compromised to the point that you had to block these rituals. So this was the kind of subtle legal debate between these two scholars, and the details are in the book, but I really try to make the argument this is not a debate between law and Sufism. This is not a debate between reformers and non-reformers. Okay, so with that preliminary in place, I actually want to go back to the early 19th century now, and I will not really bring up the Deobandis and Barelvis anymore in this talk, but I want to go to the early 19th century and talk about the predecessors to these two movements, who occupy the first part of my book. So the predecessors to these two movements really belong to two major families, who are, of course, representatives of two major strands of reform in South Asian Islam. On the one hand, you have the family of Shah Wali Ullah, the esteemed and celebrated scholar who died 1762. And on the other hand, you have another family called the Khairabadi school, which primarily focuses on disciplines like logic and philosophy, and a very formidable and Hadith as well school. And it is really a debate that I focus on in the first part of my book between the grandson of Shah Waliullah, someone called Shah Muhammad Ismail, a very interesting and a prolific scholar, who oftentimes is, I think, unfairly categorized as some kind of an Indian Salafi. He's much more complicated than that, in ways that I try to show in the book as well. And then on the other side was someone who was much younger than him, but was a very formidable opponent called Fazl Haq Khairabadi, arguably the most well-known scholar from the Khairabadi school, who was an important poet, an aristocrat, a government bureaucrat first, but then his relationship with the British turned sour, and he was thrown into the infamous prison after the War of 1857. But this was a debate that took place between them in the early 19th century, so around 1830 or so, or 1826 to 1830, around that time period. And they debated things like prophetic intercession, and which occupies a couple of chapters in my book. But the debate I really want to focus on is one that they had on the twin questions of, can God produce a second prophet? And can God renege on his own promise or not? Or what is called imkani kizb. Can God lie or not? I really want to focus on the first part of it. Can God produce a second prophet or not? This was a very sensitive debate that took place between them, but in a way that was very candid. I think the way that they took place, the way that they conducted this debate would be very difficult in the conditions today. But I actually want to now focus on this particular debate. So Shah Muhammad Ismail, the Shah Waliullah's grandson, he, of course, publishes a number of different books in Urdu, Arabic, Persian. Most of these scholars were trilingual, of course. But his most famous book is his reformist tract that he published called Taqwiyatul Iman, or Fortifying Faith, or Energizing Faith, in 1826, in which he really came down hard on a number of different rituals and customs in India, and said that all of them compromised divine sovereignty. So it really was an argument, a reformist text in Urdu for re-energizing divine sovereignty. Now, in that text, details of which I analyze in the book as well, but there was one or two statements that he made which became particularly controversial. And from those statements in that text, published in 1826 in the vernacular Urdu, that this whole debate around the question of can God produce second Muhammad or not came about. And now I want to actually turn to my own book, because it's a technical debate, so I just want to make sure that I am precise in what I say. So I'll read a bit. I'm reading from page 97 of my book here. Um, the most controversial aspect of Ismail's theology was the absolute terms in which he argued for the radical alterity of divine sovereignty. In relation to the sovereign divine, he claimed all other entities, whether prophets, jinns, Satan, spirits, fairies, or saints, were equally radically inferior. In what is perhaps the most dramatic affirmation of this sentiment, in what has since proven to be the most controversial moment in this text, Ismail declared, and here I'm reading from Taqwiyatul Iman, he said, God is so powerful that in one moment, just by uttering the command be, he can create millions of new prophets, saints, jinns, angels, Gabriels, and Muhammads. Now, how did he make this argument? Ismail framed his argument, and this actually, his framing and his explanation comes in a different text called Yakroza, which is a Persian text, much more philosophical and much more, not really for a general public, but he wrote this text when he was critiqued by Fazl Kharabadi, and then in response to that, he wrote this book, arguably in one day, hence this Persian text is called Yakroza. So I'm coming to that now. How did he make this argument? Ismail framed his argument by drawing on the distinction between potentiality, imkan, and actuality, wuku. He argued that although God had the capacity to create a million new Muhammads or lie and contravene his own promise, he would never actually do so. Let me elaborate. We can usefully flesh out Ismail's argument here by noticing its resemblance with what the theorist Giorgio Agamben has described as a distinction between potentiality and actuality in Aristotle's thought. In Aristotle's conceptualization, Agamben argued, potentiality precedes actuality and conditions it, but also seems to remain essentially subordinate to it. Meaning, Aristotle takes great care to affirm the autonomous existence of potentiality. What that means is this: the fact that the Kithara player keeps his potential, potenza, to play even when he does not play, and the architect keeps his potential to build even when he does not build. Agamben drew from Aristotle the critical insight that for potentiality to have its own autonomous existence, it must be able not to pass over into actuality. As Agamben put it, if potentiality is to have its own consistency and not always disappear immediately into actuality, it is necessary that potentiality be able not to pass over into actuality, that potentiality also be impotentiality. Now, Ismail's argument that God can create a million new Muhammads is located precisely in this zone of indistinction between pure potentiality and actuality, which for Agamben and as well as for Ismail is the zone of indistinction where divine sovereignty rests, whereby potentiality never quite crosses over into actuality but remains in a relationship of suspension. But how did he make this argument? Let me make more specific here. And I'll just give a couple of examples for the sake of time. In making his argument, Ismail cited a number of different verses in the Quran, for example, such as verses 81 and 82 of chapter 36 of Surah Yasin, whereby it says in the Quran, does not the one, that is God, who created the heavens and earth, possess the capacity to create the likes of them? Of course he does. He's the all-knowing creator. His command is such that when he wants something, he just says be, and it becomes kun fayakun. Now, since this verse described the day of judgment, Ismail argued the phrase the likes of them apply to all those entities, including all humans, who would then be brought back to life. God possessed the capacity to create the likes of everyone who would be resurrected on Judgment Day. This verse demanded the necessity of this correlation. Now, it was among the necessities of religion to have faith in the tenet that the prophet was also a human being who would come alive on Judgment Day. Therefore, Ismail continued connecting the dots. God must, according to this verse, possess the capacity of creating another Muhammad. He said in Persian, "Pas wujud misl nabi dakhil basha taht qudrat ilahiyya bi muqtazai karima maskura." Why? Because God possessed the capacity to create the likes of whoever would come to life on Judgment Day. And that was my point in Taqwiyatul Iman, Ismail said. There are a number of other verses, but I'll just move to his other main argument for the sake of time. Now, other than presenting a number of specific Quranic verses, the central argument that sustained Ismail's line of defense in Yakroza of why he had said that God can create a million new Muhammads rested on the distinction between two categories: what is called essentially impossible, mumtana bil dhat, and indirectly impossible, mumtana bil ghair. Mumtana bil dhat referred to a logical impossibility, something that was impossible in essence or substance. On the other hand, mumtana bil ghair referred to an impossibility that was impossible, not in essence, but by virtue of something else. Mumtana bil ghayr. In other words, indirectly impossible. Now, Ismail was in complete agreement with his opponents, the Kharabadi, that there had never been, was never, and never would be another Muhammad. There was no debate about that. This debate is not about whether there will be Muhammad or not. He was completely clear there will never be another creation like Muhammad. But the disagreement was the nature of this impossibility. For Ismail, God producing Muhammad's like was not essentially impossible, but only indirectly impossible. God could do these things if he wanted. He had the potentiality, like Aristotle. However, like Aristotle talked about potentiality, God could do these things if he wanted. However, he did not and would not for the non-essential, in the literal sense of that term, reason that these acts did not fit his theological program. On this principle, he launched the case that since the absence and impossibility of Muhammad's replica were not essential, but only indirectly impossible, the presence of such a replica was essentially possible. I'll repeat here and make it clearer perhaps. Since God could obviously enact what was essentially possible, it was proved that God possessed the capacity to produce another Muhammad, or for that matter, to renege on his own promise. That was all he had tried to do and tried to say in Taqwatul Iman, Ismail pleaded. Now let me turn to the opposing argument. So this argument really created a firestorm in colonial South Asia and continues until today. And in fact, the later scholars of Deoband defended Ismail on this position of the distinction between potentiality and actuality. And really the crux of his position is that this is a potentiality that never crosses over into actuality, but you cannot rob God of this potentiality because that would undermine his sovereignty. And the other main point is this distinction between something that is essentially impossible or indirectly impossible. So he's saying that this is an indirect impossibility. It is not an essential impossibility, because then you would rob God of the potentiality of doing something that he had said that he could do in the Quran itself in terms of resurrecting people in the afterlife. Now the opposing argument. How did Fazl Kharabadi, this really important logician, philosopher, he came down very hard on Ismail, and I just want to give you the gist of his opposing argument to make things very specific here. Now, Kharabadi's argument was that Ismail's position is at once logically and normatively untenable, and also morally repugnant and incendiary. For Kharabadi, God's creating another Muhammad was essentially impossible. Mumtana bizat. The possibility of another Muhammad would mean the possibility of another prophet, thus necessitating the falsification of the conclusive text of the Quran. This was so because the Quran had explicitly and famously stated, Muhammad is not the father of any of your men, he is rather God's messenger and the seal of all prophets. Kharabadi urged his readers and the masses to not take Ismail's claims casually. He was not only claiming that another entity could share the humanity of Muhammad, that would not be controversial. Rather, according to Kharabadi, Ismail was arguing for the possibility of another entity that shared with Muhammad all of the latter's perfect attributes, Awsaf Kamila. According to Kharabadi, Ismail's strategy of mobilizing Quranic verses to show God's capacity to bring into existence any animate or inanimate entities by just proclaiming be, kun fayakun, was fatally flawed. The central problem with this kind of hermeneutic was that it was inapplicable to the figure of Muhammad. Moreover, Ismail's argument was tenable only through an egregiously decontextualized reading of such verses. So, for example, Kharabadi insisted that this verse does not God who created the heavens and earth possess the capacity to create the likes of them from Surah Yasin. Of course he does. He is the all-knowing creator. His command is such that when he wants something, he just says be and it becomes. This verse from Surah Yasin. Kharabadi schooled Ismail that this was intended as a response to the recalcitrant unbelievers of Mecca who had denied the afterworld and had rejected God's capacity to bring human bodies and bones to life on Judgment Day. They had mockingly asked, as recorded a few verses later, who would possibly give life to these decrepit bones? So the verse in question responded to this provocation. And the phrase, the likes of them, Kharabadi stressed, referred to the fragile materiality of the human body. Therefore, this phrase could not, by any stretch of the imagination, be made to refer to the equal of the possessor of all perfections, the Prophet. There was no relationality or vector of comparison between bringing the human body back to life and creating the like of the possessor of all human perfections, the Prophet. Citing a Quranic verse that referred to the former and extending its meaning to encompass the latter was a work of exegesis unbefitting a competent scholar. So, and according to Kharabadi, primarily this was an essential impossibility because otherwise I would contravene the underlying doctrine and dogma of the finality of the prophet. So this was a slightly technical debate, and there are specificities that are, for more details, the part 1 of my book, chapters 3 and 5, is where I really go into the details of this debate in more detail. But notice that at stake here really are two things. One is competing uh, emphasis on what will constitute the tradition and conditions of modernity, where you have one scholar who is really trying to emphasize the question of energizing divine sovereignty. And for that, he is willing to go the extra mile in trying to show the humanity of the prophet, to make these kinds of provocative statements in trying to make the argument. And one of the main charges against Shah Muhammad Ismail was that he's being irreverential, that he's being offensive towards the prophet. And his main reply to that was quite interesting. He said, no, in fact, I'm the one who's clearing up things in a time where these kinds of moral precepts need to be clarified. We don't need to be talking in implicit ways or in kind of subtle language, etc. But we need to make it very, very clear that divine sovereignty is uncompromising and really need to emphasize and celebrate the prophet's humanity. And that's the way how you love him. And you need to talk clearly, and I need to talk in ways that would be understandable and would make an impact to the masses. So I'm trying to make an impact with the masses, and this is how you talk, to clarify things. I'm actually doing a great service to the masses. I'm not offending anyone. That was his counter argument. And on the other hand, you have Fazl Kharabadi, for whom the hierarchy, the spiritual hierarchy of God, God's beloved, and then Sufi masters, and then the common people, that kind of spiritual hierarchy had to be maintained, had to be reinforced. And this kind of doctrinal chaos that questions like, can God produce a second Muhammad or not, had to be confronted. So what I tried to argue here was that notice that at work in the seemingly very technical theological debate about the relationship between divine sovereignty and prophetic authority are two competing political theories and political models. One which is based on emphasizing the radical alterity and the radical absoluteness of divine sovereignty as a way to make the case for the humanity of the prophet, and thus to make a case for a non-hierarchical relationship between the human and God, which in some ways mirrors these new conceptions of democracy and new conceptions of critiques of hierarchy that are existing in the early modern period. And on the other hand, you have Fazl Kharabadi and his likes of his scholars who are really trying to emphasize the hierarchy, the spiritual hierarchy, the theological hierarchy that should govern the relationship between God and humans. And that in some ways mirrors and is a reflection of an earlier kind of a Mughal hierarchy of a politics that is invested in really securing and reinforcing that hierarchical political social worldview. So what I tried to argue here was that, in fact, at stake in these seemingly theological and technical debates were two competing political theologies, two competing political theories that map onto this hinge moment in South Asian history, when one political order is dissipating, is disintegrating, and making way for another political order. So in these kinds of hinge moments of political uncertainty, what kinds of theological debates and what kinds of theological discourses come about and are imagined? And I was not trying to make some kind of a cause and effect argument that, when the British come in, this affects, this is the cause for the effect of theological arguments. No, I was trying to look at the mutual imbrication, the mutual syncopation between the theological and the political, to think about this debate as beyond just some kind of a technical debate between scholars of that time, but reflective of a much more consequential political theology. So I think I will stop there.
Thank you very much for that, and quite a climax, and you just dropped the bomb. Really impressive stuff, and I have quite a few questions I would like to throw that, but for those of you who joined us, you can raise the hand, or you can just unmute yourself and ask the question. If you choose to, you can just write the question in the chat, but better not to. I mean, if you can ask it yourself. I'll take advantage of my role as a moderator here, and I wanted to ask to what degree the question of the modality of the prophet's life in the intermediary life, the barzakh, is relevant to these debates, because if we speak in terms of, and again, I'm reflecting here on particular kind of my work in Saudi Arabia, but I mean, the conception of the intermediary role of the Prophet in the now is very much related to conceptions of his life in the barzakh, in the intermediary life. So I was wondering to what degree that becomes a relevant debate in like with the people that you're dealing with. And if I can throw this there too, and perhaps I might have a chance to ask a few more questions a little bit later on. Where is the emotional dimension of the relationship between God and the Prophet kind of situated in these debates? Because like at least in the Middle East, right, the argument has been made that the secularization of the persona of the Prophet with the reform movement, right, kind of portrayed the Prophet as quote unquote as the mailman, as the person who brought the message and then is gone. And the people who have insisted on the continuous presence of the charisma of the Prophet and the continuity of the barakah of the Prophet in the life of the community, right, is in many ways reflective of a particular relationship of God with the Prophet as the beloved of God, as the one whose name has been written before creation in the doorways of paradise. And so I think that exclusivity speaks to an emotional dimension, if we can speak in terms of emotion, but in terms of love and divine love, etc. And this idea of God's potential to produce many Muhammads as kind of leads to a more technical a focus or an emphasis on the technical function of the Prophet. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Thank you, Besnik. I'll briefly address both of those questions and try to bring them together. So I think two things I will say in response to those questions. The first thing is that one should keep in mind that even for scholars who very obviously had a stake in and were trying to emphasize the humanity of the Prophet, and were very invested in securing the humanity of the Prophet, and had this anxiety about that humanity not being undermined through the ritual life of the masses, or in terms of their conceptions of the relationship between divine sovereignty and prophetic authority. They also frame their discourse in the language of love. So that emotive aspect, in fact, does not get lost. And in fact, for them, this is a way of loving the Prophet, which is to celebrate and to re-emphasize his humanity. As I quoted Ashraf Ali Thanvi earlier, that the perfection of the Prophet's prophethood lies in the perfection of his humanity. And that in some ways is a kind of moral exemplar and these scholars also, of course, are major Sufi masters to re-emphasize this point. I mean, Ashraf Ali Thanvi perhaps is the most prolific Sufi master of modern South Asia, who then is also having this kind of an emphasis on the Prophet's humanity. Shah Muhammad Ismail, whom I just mentioned here, he has another text called The Station of Leadership, which is on a political theory of ideal forms of leadership in Islam, and he emphasizes that politics ultimately is a modality of love, whereby the leader is trying to curate a political community whereby the distinctive markers of Islam or Sha'air al-Islam are preserved, and that in some ways is a labor of love. So, and all of them would agree on the status of the Prophet in the Barzakh, etc. But their main concern is with how the Prophet becomes manifest in the religious imaginaries and practices of the quote-unquote masses, whereby for people like Ismail and later on the Deoband pioneers, for them, if the masses begin to believe that the Prophet himself, for example, appears during his birthday celebration and is there when people stand up to for salutations, and the Prophet is in fact present there in terms of dispensing his blessings on the participants of that gathering, that can lead the masses to think that the Prophet has knowledge of the unknown, where are all the places where his birthday is being celebrated, etc. And they might get a bit misguided in terms of the capacity of the Prophet to access knowledge of the unknown. And these technical discussions of among the scholarly elite that God has knowledge of the unknown, and then he gifts part of that to the prophet, something that both the Barelvis and the Deobandis agreed on. That technical nuance will get missed if that is their immediate belief. So it really comes down to the question of a the question of what imaginary of the prophet will govern the moral economy of the everyday. And there are two competing conceptions on that question. Whereas for one group of scholars, you need to be cautious there. You need to be cautious, and you really need to re-emphasize for the masses the humanity of the prophet so that they don't even go there to cultivate any forms of beliefs and practices that would undermine divine sovereignty in these conditions whereby political sovereignty has already been lost. So when political sovereignty has been lost, it's really in divine sovereignty and its immediacy and its absoluteness that you would maintain or retain some notion of Muslim identity in modernity. Whereas for the competing groups of scholars, yes, the masses are not to be relied on, and they need to be constantly patrolled, especially the women among them have to be constantly patrolled. But once you begin denying things like the prophet's gift of the unknown knowledge, and once you go on that path of trying to talk about these scandalous things like can God produce a million other Muhammads, and you especially do that in texts which are written in the vernacular Urdu, that will lead to this kind of doctrinal chaos where what then cannot be imagined? What then cannot, if a God can produce a million new Muhammads, then the God can also do a number of other things that would enter into the imaginary of these gullible masses. So we need to, the way to retain, and for them also, when political sovereignty is lost, it is in the figure of an authoritative and charismatic prophet who compensates for that loss of sovereign power. So both of these groups of scholars, in some ways, through the theologies they're curating, are wrestling with the context whereby different notions of sovereignty and sovereign power are being imagined. And the question is, what is the place of the prophet in terms of compensating for that loss of political sovereignty? As a perfect human who would regulate the lives of the masses in a way that is constantly guarding the absoluteness of divine sovereignty, that would be the Deoband scholars and Shah Muhammad Ismail, or in a way that the status of the prophet as the most beloved subject of God would be something that would compensate for that loss of political sovereignty. So these are the two competing conceptions. So when it comes to the technical details, many of these things they're in agreement with. Both of them are in agreement of the status of the prophet and Barzakh. They both agree that God has knowledge of the unknown and he gifts part of that to the prophet. But the question is, how much of this kind of internal debate are you going to share with the masses? And what kind of a relationship between divine sovereignty, prophetic authority, and the practice of everyday life will you present as an ideal norm in conditions of modernity defined by the loss of political sovereignty? That is my wager in this book in some ways. So it really comes down to, in many ways, how do you talk about the prophet, the etiquette of speech. So for Khairabadi, in fact, he says at one point in his text that, okay, fine, if you want to make that argument, fine. But why did you have to make this argument in the vernacular Urdu, where all the masses can access it? And why are you sowing these kinds of discord, this kind of heretical thoughts in the minds of the masses who don't know these technical categories like mumtana bil-dhat, mumtana bil-ghair, and can't make these distinctions, etc., can't get into these kinds of debates? Why are you introducing why are you expanding the parameters of thinkability? Once the parameters of thinkability are expanded, everything becomes thinkable. And in fact, later scholars who were commenting on Shah Muhammad Ismail and were defending Fazl Khairabadi, they make the argument that Shah Muhammad Ismail, in fact, is a proto-Ahmadi. They make this argument that he's the one who opened the doors for these kinds of discussions to happen in South Asian Islam, and which is an interesting kind of an argument, a very polemical argument, of course, in the context of South Asia. But their main argument is once you expand the boundaries of thinkability, doctrinal chaos will ensue. Whereas the opposing argument is that you have to be very clear and very without any nuance, without any subtlety, get the point to the masses, shake them up, because that's what they need. They're completely buried under a moral malaise, and to really shake them up, you need to electrify them and jolt them a bit. And that's what he's trying to do in that text. And the same Shah Muhammad Ismail, last one I'll make, sorry, I'm speaking too much right now, is that the same Shah Muhammad Ismail in his other texts in Persian, Arabic, etc., could have a very specialist philosophical language as well, in which he completely departs from this kind of popular language. So that's the other point I wanted to make, that these scholars, based on their audiences and the kind of text they're writing, will have different shades of nuance on these questions and different sort of emphases, points of emphasis on these different points. Anyways, I'll stop there.
No, that's fascinating. I'm glad you did touch upon that. It's interesting once you get into the economy of Sadr Darai, and I mean, where do you end kind of, you know, cutting the means? But let's give it a chance. We have a question from our colleague here, Florian Lutzen, who says, "Hi, and thank you very much for the interesting perspective. Could you speak a little bit about how maybe Shah Wali Allah would have argued regarding the main question you presented, how he would have spoken about the central role of the Prophet Muhammad?"
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. There's a section in my book where it's if grandson meets grandfather, which I do a comparison between Shah Muhammad Ismail and Shah Waliullah, and how do they compare with each other? On the one hand, there are many commonalities. They share this notion of reform. They share a notion of moral decay that South Asian Muslims need to be jolted out of. And there are some interesting points of comparison, in fact, in their Sufi thought as well. But the main difference between them is that Shah Waliullah was much more cautious about these kinds of questions. So there is a very interesting narrative that I relay in the book as well, where you have a scholar who comes to visit Shah Waliullah in Delhi, and he's from this other group of scholars called the non-conformists, the Ghair Muqallidun, or the Ahl Hadith of South Asia. So you have these three major schools of thought: Deobandis, Barelvis, and the Ahl Hadith. So the predecessor to that, of course, in the 18th century there was no Ahl Hadith, but before that there were people who did not conform to the canonicity of the legal schools. So some Ghair Muqallid non-conformist comes to visit Shah Waliullah in Delhi, and when he goes to the mosque, he performs this ritual of raising the two hands during prayers in a way that was not according to the Hanafi norms, but according to the or the non-conformist norm. So people really get upset there, and they're about to beat him up, this guest of his, and he says, no, don't say anything. I'm a guest of Shah Waliullah. So they say, okay, then let's take him to his house, and he will decide what to do with this issue. So they take him to his house, and they say that this guy is saying that he is your guest, but he performs the Raf'ul Yadayn, the raising of the hands, in a way that does not conform to our norms. So Shah Waliullah says, there are multiple hadith on this question, and sometimes I also depart from the Hanafi norm on this question, so let him go. So on that, they let him go. So then later on, the guest says to Shah Waliullah, I didn't know that you also sometimes depart from the Hanafi norm on this question. He said, actually, I don't, but I said that because if I had not, they would have beaten you to death. So that in some ways captures the sentiment, or the what I should call the kind of temperament, whereby there was a notion of reform that was articulated quite clearly also, but his grandson was much more adamant on this question of, no, the moral malaise has reached a point where you have to make provocative statements, and you have to extend the process theology to a point that would really bring home the primacy of divine sovereignty. So my reply to this would be that, yes, he had a conception of reform, but he was very, very careful to keep the different aspects and the different political, theological sort of currents of that time, not only within South Asia, but also outside of it. Of course, he had traveled extensively to the Hijaz as well. He was much more of a mender, as much as he also had a notion of reform that oftentimes does correspond with that of his grandson or the later scholars. But I think the temperament is a bit different, and that I think is a reflection of different times as well, of the late 18th century and the early 19th century, but also different personalities as well. But that's a very fascinating question of the differences, but also commonalities between the two.
Thank you. And we have a question from Iftikhar Ahmed, who asks, can you trace and embed in your conception how this debate continued in later times, such as by Deobandi scholar Nautavi in Takhdir al-Nas, and how this led to today's movement of finality of prophethood?
Great question. Thank you so much, Iftikhar, for that question. So absolutely. So in some ways, a debate which was primarily between different individuals, in this case Fazl Kharabadi and Shah Muhammad Ismail, later on took a much more group-centered orientation, where you have the emergence of these competing groups in the late 19th century after the 1857 mutiny, in the form of Deobandis, Barelvis, the Ahl Hadith, etc. So that is one key transformation that takes place, that these debates and conversations that were centered on competing individuals like Fazl Kharabadi, Shah Muhammad Ismail, take on a much more group-centered orientation. And as I said earlier, the Deoband pioneers, such as the founder of the school, Rashid Ahmad Gangohi, who died 1906, explicitly defended Ismail on this point. He said, yes, Ismail never said that God will actually produce another Muhammad, or God will actually lie. but in fact, he was only talking about the potentiality. And God has himself said that, he might throw certain figures like Abu Lahab, etc., into hell, but he could also change that decision. You cannot rob God of that potentiality. And then the opponents of Deoband, primarily Ahmad Raza Khan, the founder of the Barelvi school, again went back at them and said that this is essentially impossible. So in some ways rehearsed Khairabadi's point and some other aspects as well. So yes, Qasim Nanotwi, who's the other co-founder of Deoband along with Rashid Ahmad Gangohi, in the Tahdirun Nas repeats this point, and in some ways is indebted to Shah Mahmud Ismail. He's very influenced by him. He is indebted to him in many ways on a number of questions, not only these theological questions, but also on the question, for example, of widow remarriage, in which Shah Mahmud Ismail was a major protagonist of trying to erase the quote-unquote Hindu taboo against widow remarriage. So he leads this whole campaign to get widows remarried across North India. And his own sister is a widow who has not been remarried for a long time. And Shah Mahmud Ismail, there is this famous episode and narrative whereby one day he's giving a sermon in a mosque and he's talking about the virtues of widow remarriage, and someone raises his hand and he realizes that this person will now ask me about my own sister. So he rushes back home and falls in the feet of his sister and says that, oh, sister, you have to get remarried, or the efficacy of my sermons will no longer be available. And she says, oh, brother, I'm so old. How will I get remarried? But then he really urges her and she eventually gets remarried. So this exact same episode, this exact same narrative comes back in Qasim Nanotwi's biographies, and his biography, for example, Sawan-e Qasimi, that was written by Manazir Hasan Gailani. He repeats the same narrative, exact same narrative, but this time the sister is Qasim Nanotwi. So anyways, a long-winded way to say that Nanotwi is very much inspired and influenced by Shah Mahmud Ismail on this question as well. And then Tahdirun Nas gets refuted by someone like Ahmad Raza Khan. And the refutation then gets defended by other Deoband, and the whole thing continues, of course. So yes, the interesting thing about the second part of the question, this whole movement of finality of prophethood. So the interesting thing here is two things. One is that, and this in some ways points to maybe the difference between the 19th century context and the present context, the post-colonial context. So, those who have really been at the center of this finality of prophethood argument, today, for example, oftentimes you might argue that they are affiliated with this Barelvi school because they're really into defending the Prophet's honor and love for the Prophet, his status as the most beloved of all scholars, of all figures rather. But today, for example, in contexts like Pakistan, many Deobandis and Barelvis have come together on this particular question of the finality of prophethood. Whereas if you go back to the tradition of Deoband scholars, there are some of these thorny, difficult to resolve places where you have Rashid Ahmad Gangohi defending Shah Mahmud Ismail on the question of can God produce a million new Muhammads? He explicitly defends them. But in the contemporary context, because this debate or this whole sort of controversy is seen one which pits against each other Muslim clerics against a modernist state and an international kind of economy of discourse, many Deobandis and Barelvi groups have actually come together on this particular question and set aside their earlier debates and their earlier sort of tensions on this precise question. And leading the way are these more popular outfits and popular clerics from movements like this Tehreek-e-Labbaik Ya Rasulullah in Pakistan today, which may not have the same kind of standing and the same kind of intellectual pedigree as Ahmad Raza Khan or these Deoband pioneers, but they're the ones who are leading the way, and the ulama, the more traditionalist ulama and the more sophisticated ulama, in fact, are being forced to tag along with that bandwagon. So in some ways, that is a major difference that has happened in the post-colonial moment, where I think, as I said earlier, whatever you say about this debate between Khairabadi and Ismail, whichever position you might find more convincing, or later between Deobandis and Barelvis, it is very interesting to note the candidness with which this debate is taking place and the openness with which this debate is taking place on some very sensitive questions. Whereas today, with texts like Tahzirun Nas or Hifzul Iman of Ashraf Ali Thanvi, where he talks about this debate as well, many of these texts, in fact, in 2015 and 16, when the Pakistani state was trying to clamp down on sectarianism, what they did was they tried to ban controversial books. Now, what is controversial, that nobody could understand because they really did not have access to the technicalities of these texts. So once I remember I was trying to find a text in the Anarkali section of Lahore, and one of these texts called Hifzul Iman by Ashraf Ali Thanvi was banned. And I said, can I have that text? And this guy is sort of very secretly giving it to me and said, don't show it to anyone or else I will be booked under the anti-terrorism sections and be thrown into jail. And there was these very funny narratives of police going door to door asking for long dead authors and saying that where is Shibli Nomani that we could arrest, who wrote this book on the Prophet, etc. So that really shows a disconnect between a modernist state who does not know what to do with controversy and polemics and the technicalities and the nuances of these texts and this textual economy. So final thing I would say in response to your question is that, yes, this 19th century history is central to the present. This is the history of our legacy of the present. But this 19th century past is also quite different from the present in terms of the degree of candidness with which these debates could be had, the kind of fault lines between different scholars, and just the number of actors who've entered the public sphere today, and the introduction of social media, etc., is something that really distinguishes the present moment from this 19th century context that I'm describing, which is much more technical, which is much more specialized. I'll pause there.
Before asking Siraj Khan from Max Planck Foundation to unmute himself, I also wanted to add that, I mean, I kind of suggested the parallels with the religious debates that happen in Saudi Arabia, but I have to say, I mean, primarily based on your book and your presentation today, that the level of sophistication is by far non-comparable with the Saudi context, where the debate has been primarily limited into quoting previous texts and arguing without any level of kind of, even to the level of commentary, one might say, on the significance of those texts. So it is testimony to a more complex and a richer kind of debate, I'd say. But please, yes, Siraj Khan, if you can please unmute yourself and
thank you very much. Yes, sorry, I'm connecting with my work account, so that's why it says that. But I'm actually at Tübingen as well. I'm studying there. Thank you very much for the presentation. I've not read your book yet, which I must do as soon as I can. But I'd be interested to hear more about this point that you mentioned a minute ago about the colonial context or the post-colonial context in which these debates were taking place. And I mean, at least if we look at the time when Shah Muhammad Ismail was around, you do have this nation making or state building process going on at the time. What one could argue that there are some parallels in the modern period where the state is almost not present in Pakistan nowadays, where there is a contestation again for the political space in the building of in the current political context in Pakistan. So my question would really be, to what extent are these debates hindered or spurred on by the political context, where there is a clear gap in providing a kind of unifying Muslim doctrinal voice from the state, which is perhaps being an Islamic republic is perhaps expected of the state to do, and therefore kind of making the ground quite fertile for these kind of debates to take place. And the second kind of add-on to that would be, you mentioned that in the modern period, these debates are happening much more candidly. At the same time, we do have a kind of criminalization of these debates, as you've referred to yourself, and therefore there is an argument to say that these debates are not being had with the level of yes, technicality, but also with the level of pluralism or diversity that they should perhaps be allowed to flourish in, obviously within the remits of technical discourses. So do you see this ending up with different results from the post-colonial period in which these first took place?
Yeah, no, I'll address this. Thank you, Siraj, so much. I'll address the second question first. Yes, very much so. And this is the note on which I end the book as well, that, one should not think that a polemic or an intra-Muslim debate, which is about these very sensitive questions, which was very antagonistic in many places, must result in violence, right? So that in some ways is the underlying argument or the underlying assumption that drives these kinds of moves to ban texts and to really put these kinds of debates under the radar, which is that a polemic or an intra-Muslim debate on sensitive questions will definitely resolve or resort to violence, whereas this is a 19th century debate where very sensitive things were discussed, oftentimes very antagonistically, even resulted in declarations of unbelief of opposing scholars, but did not resort to, the kind of violence that we see in the present moment. In fact, the more you try to ban something, and the more you try to hide something, the more visible it will become, but in ways and in forms which will be much less sophisticated. So my argument here is that regardless of which side you might be on, and regardless of which side you find more convincing, and even if you have no stakes in this debate, normatively, and if this is not a matter of strong evaluation for you, to quote Charles Taylor, it is still useful to be proficient in these debates because they are a very important part of the legacy of modern Islam and especially South Asian Islam. That acquiring some proficiency in what was at stake for these competing groups of scholars, how did they make their arguments, what were the ambiguities in their arguments, this would be really useful to know for especially for non-religious specialists who are trying to engage with this tradition, and then your critique of them will also be more effective. So one of the blind spots of modernism, Muslim modernism or modernism more broadly speaking in South Asia, is this kind of way in which this whole tradition and their debates have been completely dismissed and without an attempt to listen eagerly to this internal other about what was at stake for these scholars and their debates and so on. So I think that in fact is a tragic aspect of the present. And as I said, I think the kind of candidness and openness with which these two scholars were engaging in this debate, or later on the Deobandis and Barelvis, that would be impossible, almost impossible in today's context. And hence, most people are unfamiliar with the texture of these debates, with the reasons behind them, and what you get, what remains really is these very incendiary or very ways of engaging in these kinds of questions, which are either resorting to violence or complete shutting down of any discussion. Both of these sides, I think, are problematic and really are go against the thrust of the tradition itself in some ways. So that's the second part of the question. The first question on the comparison of the political context. So I think the early 19th century context is quite interesting because you in fact have a context in which British colonial power also had not yet fully consolidated yet. So you have this 1826 to 30 moment where you have the British colonial power is gradually consolidating and Mughal sovereignty is gradually dissipating. And hence there is this kind of political uncertainty and this kind of hinge moment where what exactly is the status of sovereignty is in flux. And that kind of flux makes it possible for scholars like Shah Muhammad Ismail to come into the public sphere and make these kinds of arguments which may have existed in the pre-modern period. And there are precedents to these kinds of arguments. But the kind of popularity that it gains and the kind of way in which it necessitates opposing scholars to really confront this argument, the kind of urgency with which Fazlullah Kharabadi has to now enter the public sphere and confront Shah Muhammad Ismail is something quite new. And I think that is made possible by precisely this moment of flux where the status of sovereignty itself is in flux. By the late 19th century, the situation that you have is that the British colonial state has evacuated a sphere of religious debate and passions and has said that you take this sphere, you debate your religions, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, whoever you might be, as long as you don't infringe on our political sovereignty. And once that happens, we will intervene. Otherwise, we will not intervene. And hence, in some ways, I think these debates become so popular and they take on the kind of the way they operate oftentimes is in separation of the colonial state, but at stake really in their debates is this lost sovereignty. And you cannot recover the sovereignty through the state anymore. Both the Bareillis and Deobandis realize that. So hence you have alternate conceptions of sovereignty, alternate conceptions of how the sovereign power has to be restored through regulating the everyday lives of the community. And that in some ways, this loss of sovereignty and how to compensate for that, that really pressing question is what makes these debates so urgent and so contested in the late 19th century. By the present moment, I think the context is that you have a state that is at once very powerful and also very fragile at the same time. Powerful in the sense that it can have punitive measures for people that it considers to be good Muslims or bad Muslims, depending on their particular orders that it gets from imperial centers at different moments. Sometimes it bans books because it wants to now show its face as a moderate Muslim, and other times it props up most extreme forms of the tradition because it wants to undermine the political authority of some other actor. So the state itself is quite confused about how to act. But primarily the reason for that is that it is a modernist elite, whether that is a military elite or the political elite, it is a modernist elite that really is improficient and is really unconversant in this tradition. So hence they don't know how to deal with these traditions, and hence the most extreme forms of them become most authoritative at different moments in history. So in some ways, this is an argument for taking seriously the academic study of Islam and religion. One doesn't have to be a specialist, but at least some proficiency will be very useful for the modernist elite for their own good. So that's basically the argument I'm trying to make, the larger political argument I'm trying to make through this book.
That's very, very enlightening. Thank you very much.
And we also have a question from Florian Lutzen. Florian, if you can unmute yourself.
Yes, thanks. I want to come back to my question. It's rather a comment than a question now. I have to admit that my knowledge on the 19th century regarding the Deobandis and the Relvis is quite limited. But I was very much reminded of another discourse I'm a little more familiar with, and another figure which is who lived in the 19th century, also 18th, 19th century, was Ahmed ibn Idris al-Fasi in Morocco. And I was quite reminded of the discourses. And also, of course, it's different, but a little bit the same. It revolves around the figure of the Prophet. But in the case of Ahmed ibn Idris, it's also regarding the madhabs, how to follow and how strictly you should or must follow a madhab. But coming back to the figure of the Prophet, in this case, it becomes very distinct, very important for the later Sanusiya and the personal relationship to the Prophet. So I was just reminded of that. It happens in the same period. I don't think this was as pressing as it was in the 19th century, in the 18th or the 17th century. I mean, the discourse were just different, and I'm surprised that you can observe it here and there, and I don't think there's a relation, or they knew everything of each other. So just a comment. Yeah.
Right. No, that's a very interesting comment, and this I think more work needs to be done on these both the specific differences between different contexts, but also some commonalities between this question of the Prophet and modernity, and in what ways do new imaginaries of the Prophet that continue with earlier debates in Islam, of course, which have a pre-modern history, but what are some of the specifically modern ways in which these debates unfold on precisely these kinds of questions? And of course, you have the context of British missionaries in South Asia as well, where you have this investment in presenting a certain notions of the Prophet as well. But it's quite interesting how the Prophet really comes to represent a synecdoche for the body politic. And is that a modern gesture, or what are some of the modern aspects of that gesture which are thoroughly or specifically modern, globally speaking in Islam? I think that is a very worthy question that your comment brings up.
But if I may say, is that shouldn't exclude to what level the people involved in these debates knew about each other. I mean, the main person I've worked on, someone like Sayyid Muhammad Alawi al-Maliki, of course, is a very later figure, but as an inheritor of the Meccan school of the Shadhilis, also he saw himself as an inheritor of the Sanusiya and the tradition of Ahmed ibn Idris and the Ba'alawis. The first place that he went to study, he asked permission from his father. He wanted to go and study with the Deobandis because he felt that they were kind of inheritors of scholarship on Hadith, and he wanted to be a Hadith scholar. So I mean, the case has been made that particularly the Hijaz with the school of Ibrahim al-Qurani and whatnot, there is a lot of exchange happening with scholars coming from the Islamic West and Islam and scholars coming from India. So I mean, I don't know. I mean, perhaps I should go back and read with that question in mind. The book of Nasser Dumeira, who I think it's Islam in the Hijaz before the Wahhabis. I mean, because I've read his dissertation, I haven't read the book. But I think, yeah, that's something to look into. If I may, I mean, you kind of threw the idea that you wanted, perhaps you can give us a little bit of a taste of your most recent the project that you're working on, especially this idea of the relationship between Muslim and Hindus and the particular role of the Prophet in that. And so I was wondering if you're willing to say a few words about that.
I will be specific and brief as well. So my second book is called Perilous Intimacies, Debating Hindu-Muslim Friendship After Empire. It's coming out in August from Columbia University Press. So this might be one of the last times that I'm talking about this first book. It's been 3 years since it's out, so hence I had to read from it because I'd forgotten myself what the arguments were here. But in that book, I'll talk about one example. So in one of the chapters, I look at this polemical festival that takes place in the late 19th century, in 1875 and 1876. And in that polemical festival, which is organized by the British, and in collaboration with the local landed sort of a local aristocrat of this place called Shah Jahanpur in northern India, what they do is they bring together Muslim scholars, Christian missionaries, Hindu pundits for 4 days, and they say, now debate your religion, debate different aspects of your religion. And they do this for 2 consecutive years in 1875 and 1876, and talk about a number of things like how did God create the world, what is divinity, the nature of evil, rebirth and transmigration, and so on and so forth. One of the things that was debated in that polemical festival, and the main scholar from the Muslim side was this Qasim Nanotwi, whom Iftihar mentioned, the founder of Deoband. He went from the Muslim side, and from the Hindu side was this very famous founder of the Arya Samaj, the Ananda Saraswati, a major reformer of that time. So one of the debate that came up was the question of miracles, prophetic miracles. And there the question was, whose miracle is most miraculous and whose miracle is most scientifically improbable? So there, Qasim Nanotwi tried to argue that in fact it's Prophet Muhammad's miracles that are the most miraculous and in comparison to that of all other prophets. And the 2 main miracles that he discussed there was, one of them was, when before the Prophet's mosque was built in Medina, he used to give sermons while standing on a date palm tree. And then, of course, as the famous story goes, that once the pulpit was installed, one day people saw the date palm tree crying and moaning, and the Prophet consoled it. So he used that narrative to show that, look, a withering date palm tree began to cry because of the anguish it felt because of its separation from the Prophet's back. And that is the kind of charisma of the Prophet's body, that it transformed the withering date palm tree into a loving, emotional being who had reached, and this he used Sufi language, he who had reached the highest level of perfection, haqqul yaqeen, which is embodied perfection. And if you compare this miracle to all other miracles of other prophets, like Jesus' miracle of bringing the dead back to life, or Moses' miracle of turning a stick into a snake, it's not that miraculous, because ultimately when the stick became a snake, it started acting in ways that you would expect from a snake. It started biting and poisoning, etc. And then the second miracle he talked about was the Shaqul Qamar, the splitting of the moon in half. And he again said that this degenerative miracle, so the Prophet's back is a generative miracle where his body generated the capacity of love in a withering date palm tree and helped the date palm tree reach the highest level of Sufi perfection. That in terms of this degenerative miracle, that's also more superior than, say, Prophet Joshua's miracle of making the sun stay stationary, because ultimately all movement comes to rest. But to split the moon in half, that was something that was completely scientifically improbable, and hence it is the most miraculous miracle. So Dayananda Saraswati, the Hindu scholar, said that, okay, if your miracle is so miraculous, how come no mention of it is made in world histories? No world histories recorded. And there Qasim Nanotwi comes back at him and says that, look, first of all, you also have your miracles that are not recorded in world histories. In fact, we are the ones whose Hadith and Quranic verses are the most best historicized, and there are numbers and thousands of chains of transmission through which this miracle has been talked about. Where do you have that kind of historicist prowess? And then he makes this kind of a theatrical argument that he says that at the time when the moon split in half, people in India were buried under their blankets because it was midnight and there was pollution, so people did not see this moon splitting, and hence it is not recorded in world histories. So I take this example, and the detailed discussion is in the book, but I take this example to make the argument that, look, the 2 desires that are really driving this discussion is a prophet who is one whose miracles are scientifically established. So this new notion of modern science, which will now establish the miraculousness of Prophet Muhammad's miracles and whose miracles are most miraculous. And 2, this notion of a prophet who is fully historicized, that we are the more superior religion, that we have the better miracles because our miracles have been better recorded and historicized in the text. Now, of course, this idea of mutawatir and these whole traditions are pre-modern, but this is a very modern desire that the authenticity of a religion will be dependent on how carefully it can be historicized. So history, or the capacity to historicize, becomes the main playing ground and becomes the main field in which competing notions of the prophet will now be debated. So that in some ways connects with this idea that when history becomes the main grounds in which whose miracle is most miraculous and whose miracle is better historicized, that is the question that will be driving these debates. That's why these debates become even more contested. And this is what makes this debate particularly modern, in which you have a Muslim scholar who's engaging in a pre-modern tradition of munadhara, of debates and religious disputation. Miracles also have a much more pre-modern tradition. Certainly, there's nothing new about that. But what is new is this desire and anxiety to establish the Prophet as the most authoritative being through the language of modern science and through the language of modern historicism. So it shows that a traditionalist scholar like Qasim Nanotwi, who's the ultimate traditionalist, the founder of Deoband, no less, is really entangled with these new expectations and desires of colonial modernity. So I was really trying to show how older traditions of debate and disputation and older discourses of miracles become entangled in newer desires and expectations of modern science and historicism. So that's a flavor.
That's fascinating. Especially this idea of I mean, to some point, I was even thinking that, did he make the selection of selecting this to mention the miracle, the story with the date palm tree, precisely because he was speaking to a Hindu authority, and kind of engaging the natural world. But that's a fascinating. Looking forward to your work on that. Unless there are any pressing last-minute questions, I think we should be generous enough in giving Sherali a chance to rest. But if there are some last-moment questions, you're welcome to. This has been such an engaging conversation, and I think you might wish to start talking about your new book, but I think that you'll be stuck talking about defending Muhammad in modernity for quite some time to come. I think it is such a groundbreaking book indeed. And you said it's coming out. Your latest book is coming out when?
August.
In August. Okay, only a few months down the road. Congrats. That's amazing. All right. It looks like no one else is jumping to ask a question. Thank you very much for this amazing presentation. Thank you so much for your time, and this has been absolutely fun. Thank you, and honestly hope that we're gonna continue this this engagement in the future. Thank you, and thank you to all of you. Next week we have, I think that Siraj, you said that you're in Tübingen. So if you're still here next week, we're going to have Francesco Chiabotti come from Paris. He'll be here in person. He's an old friend of the center. He worked here for some time. But also we're going to provide the Zoom link online, and it's going to be the last session of this very impressive a conversation on Muslim prophetology. Thank you to all of you, and depending on where you are, good night, or enjoy the rest of the day. Sherali, thanks again. Much obliged.
Pleasure, true pleasure. Hope the conversation continues.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. Take care. I'll end this session now.